We are seeing, I mean, just a huge cultural shift right now.
Monumental one.
Yeah, and in the wake of all this rapid legalization, a really powerful, and I'd say sometimes controversial belief has taken root.
Yeah.
It's this idea that cannabis is, the gentlest kid on the block, that it's just inherently safer than the things we've lived with for centuries, like alcohol and tobacco.
And that perception gap, when you look at the data, it's
Yeah.
just staggering. We pulled the latest numbers, including a recent Gallup poll, and it gives you a perfect snapshot of where the public's head is at.
Okay.
Almost everyone, we're talking 97% of Americans, recognizes that traditional cigarettes are harmful,
Mm-hmm.
and 86% find alcohol harmful.
Right, and those numbers make total sense. It's based on decades and decades of public health warnings. But what happens when you ask that same group about cannabis?
The number just plummets. The perception of harm drops so significantly. Only 66% of Americans find marijuana harmful.
Wow.
That 20 to 30-point difference is huge. It really shows that the cultural needle has moved way ahead of where the public science communication is.
And to make this deep dive feel even more urgent, I mean, look at the current stats. More Americans now report smoking marijuana, that's around 13%, than smoking traditional cigarettes, which is down to about 11%.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So we're not just talking about some hypothetical risk profile. This is about the daily habits of millions of people right now.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to set aside the legal debates, the cultural stuff, and just jump straight into the source material.
Right into the systematic reviews, meta-analyses, large cohort studies. We need to systematically compare the objective risks across, let's say, 4 key areas:
Okay, what are they?
acute toxicity, cardiovascular health, the effects on your lungs, and then the neurological consequences. And the goal is to see if the scientific evidence really backs up this public belief that cannabis is the safest of the 3.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the most immediate danger,
Yeah.
acute lethality. This is just, can you die from a fatal dose? And researchers, they don't use gut feelings for this. They use a metric called the margin of exposure, or MOE. How does that help us compare, apples and oranges with poisons?
Think of the margin of exposure as your safety buffer. It's a really crucial tool in toxicology.
Yeah.
In simple terms, it's just a ratio. It's the ratio between the dose that causes negative effect,
So toxic dose.
a toxic dose or even the lethal one, and the dose that an average person actually takes.
Got it. So if that ratio is tiny, your average dose is really close to a toxic one, your risk is super high. If the ratio is massive, your risk is much lower. It's your margin for error.
Precisely. A lower MOE means a higher risk. And using this objective measure, researchers can just cut through all the noise and give us a cold, hard risk ranking for acute toxicity.
So which compounds end up in that top tier risk bracket, the ones with an MOE of less than 10?
That high-risk category, that's where you find alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, and heroin. The individual risk of acute harm, of overdose from these substances is just incredibly high. Other illicit compounds, they generally fall into a slightly safer risk category, so an MOE of less than 100.
So with all that data, where does cannabis land on that spectrum?
It's not even close.
Yeah.
THC consistently sits outside of those danger zones. It's typically got an MOE greater than 100 for individual use.
So it's basically impossible to consume a fatal dose.
It is virtually
But
impossible.
alcohol-
The data confirms that. And this stands in just stark contrast to alcohol, which consistently in every study holds the lowest margin of safety.
So based purely on the danger of, dying from an overdose right now, the public perception that marijuana is safer than alcohol is, well, it's fundamentally validated by the science.
It is. It's a powerful distinction, and it explains a lot of the historical overestimation of cannabis risk. But, and this is a big but, here's where it gets more complex.
Right.
We have to look at this on a population scale.
Yeah.
You have to factor in how many people use these legal substances, how often. And when you scale it up, alcohol is still number 1, still has the lowest MOE, firmly in that high-risk category.
Okay, and cigarettes.
Cigarette smoking, or nicotine, drops into that medium-risk category.
And cannabis.
Cannabis moves even further away into the low-risk range. We're talking an MOE consistently above 10,000.
10,000.
Yeah. This strongly indicates that his population-wide mortality risk has been, well, dramatically overestimated compared to alcohol and nicotine.
That sets the stage perfectly for our next section, which honestly is the massive curveball in the data. Because if the risk of acute death is so low, what about the chronic long-term cost? Let's talk heart health, because the sources present a major paradox here.
We absolutely have to. Because when you shift from acute lethality to systemic damage, particularly cardiovascular health, you find something that just defies common sense.
Okay.
A large systematic review directly comparing the adverse effects of cannabinoids in tobacco found something completely counterintuitive. It found that cannabinoid consumption had a more devastating effect on the cardiovascular system than tobacco.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Tobacco is, it's globally recognized as the #1 cause of preventable death. 7 million deaths a year.
Okay.
It causes this slow structural decay, hardening of the arteries, all this long-term damage. How can cannabis possibly be more devastating?
The key word isn't the magnitude of the chronic damage, it's the speed. The acuity of the damage.
Speed.
What shocked the researchers was that deadly adverse effects were seen in patients within just a few hours of consumption.
Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes even on their very first time using cannabinoids. It's a fast, sharp shock to the system.
That is genuinely shocking, because the public assumption is that risk requires chronic, heavy use over years. So what specific effects are we talking about here?
Myocardial infarction, heart attacks.
Wow.
And the case studies are they're telling. They often involve young, otherwise healthy males. The average age was only 31. These are people with none of the traditional risk factors, like high cholesterol or old age.
Oh.
And critically, 80% of these cannabis-induced heart attack patients showed up with symptoms within 6 hours of using.
6 hours. That just completely redefines the risk profile. So why is this happening? What's the mechanism? It must be totally different from how nicotine works.
It is. When you consume cannabinoids, they engage two key receptors, CB1 and CB2. The CB1 receptor is, it's the troublemaker here.
Okay.
When it gets activated, the sources describe it as being protherogenic. It ramps up oxidative stress, it causes endothelial damage, that's the lining of your blood vessels, and it aggressively accelerates the progression of atherosclerosis.
So in plain English, that CB1 activation is just rapidly aging your entire cardiovascular system.
Exactly. And while the CB2 receptor does have a helpful anti-inflammatory effect, the overwhelming net result seen in the clinical studies is an increased number of acute coronary syndrome cases. It's like putting your heart and your blood vessels through a rapid, high-intensity chemical stress test.
And I'm guessing the risks go beyond just the heart itself.
Correct. There are very strong links to cerebrovascular disease. Research shows that people who use marijuana just once a week or more had a 4.7 times higher risk of ischemic stroke.
4.7 times.
Yes. And we also see something called cannabis arteritis, which is this terrible progressive condition. It's clinically similar to the damage you see from tobacco, and it causes ischemia and necrosis in your limbs, often leading to amputations.
Okay, now let's quickly calibrate that against tobacco, which we know causes that slow structural decay. What's the biggest takeaway for the listener on tobacco's heart risk?
It's just the sheer scale, and there's no safe amount nugget. The risk is everywhere. Atherosclerosis, heart remodeling, a 3-fold increased risk of sudden cardiac death. But what is truly stunning is the work by Hackshaw and his colleagues.
What did they find?
They found that smoking only 1 cigarette per day causes roughly half the damage seen in patients who smoke 20 cigarettes a day.
Half the damage from just 5% of the exposure. That really puts that no safe amount idea into a stark perspective. And of course, that damage extends to everyone else in the room.
Precisely. Passive smoking, secondhand tobacco smoke, has the same debilitating adverse effects as active smoking on an adult's cardiovascular system. It increases their risk for stroke and hypertension.
So, okay, let me try to summarize this. The massive chronic damage from tobacco is still this overwhelming public health crisis.
Without a doubt.
But the acute, almost immediate cardiac danger posed by cannabinoids, especially in young people, introduces a totally different and critical risk that we just can't ignore.
That's it exactly.
Let's shift now to the lungs, moving into the breathless debate over pulmonary risks, because this is where the mechanics of how you consume the substance make a huge difference.
Absolutely. The way people smoke a joint is radically different from how they smoke a cigarette. There was an older but incredibly useful study from 1988 that systematically compared the respiratory burden. It found that smoking marijuana results in a substantially greater burden of carbon monoxide. We're talking a nearly 5-fold greater increment. And inhaled PAR, about a 3-fold increase, than smoking a similar amount of tobacco.
Whoa, hang on. 5 times the carbon monoxide per joint versus a cigarette? That's wild. Why?
It's all about the smoking dynamics. It's an effort to maximize the high. Researchers point out that marijuana smokers typically use a 2/3 larger puff volume, a 1/3 greater depth of inhalation, and most crucially, a 4-fold longer breath holding time.
Ah, the breath hold.
Yes, you are essentially using your lungs as a high-efficiency absorption chamber, driving those combustion byproducts as deep as possible and just holding them there.
So the immediate toxic load is higher with cannabis simply because users are trying to get the psychoactive effects as efficiently as possible.
Correct. But when you look at the long-term impact on lung function, the UCSF-led Cardias study found a different pattern. They confirmed the expected for tobacco, a consistent, straight-line drop in lung function with more smoking over 20 years.
More cigarettes, less lung capacity. Makes sense. What about for cannabis?
For low to moderate cannabis use, they actually found an increase in airflow rate up to a certain point.
An increase.
An increase, but, and this is the crucial context, it's all about volume. The researchers attributed this difference to the fact that most cannabis users in the study were very light users, averaging only 2 to 3 times per month, versus a pack a day for the average tobacco user.
So volume matters immensely. Okay, but let's talk cancer. Because both smokes have many of the same chemicals that become carcinogens when you burn them. Yet the big studies hasn't established a causal link between cannabis smoking and lung cancer. Why is that possible?
This is maybe the most fascinating biological differentiator in our entire deep dive. While both smokes contain these things called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pro-carcinogens, THC, in cannabis may actually inhibit the enzyme, CYP1A1, that converts them into active carcinogens.
Wait, so the THC is essentially tripping a biological circuit breaker. It's stopping the body from fully converting the dangerous chemicals into their cell-damaging form.
That is exactly what the research suggests. Nicotine, on the other hand, does the complete opposite. It activates that very same enzyme, ramping up the cancer-causing pathway.
Okay.
And it gets worse. Nicotine also activates an anti-apoptotic pathway in your respiratory cells. Now, apoptosis is programmed cell death. It's your body's quality control system for getting rid of damaged cells.
So nicotine not only helps create the carcinogens, but then it tells the damaged genetically mutated cells, no, don't die, stick around and multiply.
Yes. That is a powerful 1-2 punch for lung cancer pathogenesis.
It is, which makes the search for safer delivery methods absolutely essential. And on that, I mean, the sources do confirm that vaporizers largely eliminate that carcinogenic potential.
They do, by avoiding combustion entirely. If you aren't burning plant material, you aren't creating most of those carcinogens.
That seems like a clear win. But we have to talk about the serious vaping caveat, because that 2019 EVALI outbreak proved vaping is far from risk-free.
Oh, the EVALI EI, the electronic cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury outbreak, was devastating. 82% of the people who were hospitalized or died had vaped THC products.
So what was going on there?
The danger, it turns out, wasn't the THC itself, it was the additives. Specifically vitamin E acetate, which was used as a thickening agent, plus heavy metals leaching from the heating coils and ultrafine particulates.
So the delivery method is safer in theory, but the formulation of these illicit products made them incredibly dangerous.
Precisely. And we also have to remember that vape products contain highly concentrated THC. So you're getting much higher systemic levels, which directly increases the risk of other negative side effects, like impaired brain development or mental health issues, especially in younger users.
Let's move to our final big area of risk, the neurological consequences. Specifically, what happens when nicotine and marijuana are used together, a combination that is extremely common?
It's incredibly prevalent. Estimates show upwards of 60 to 70% of cannabis users also use tobacco. And we know that, individually, both are linked to structural brain changes, particularly in the hippocampus.
The memory center of the brain.
Exactly.
So what did the researchers see when they actually looked at brain scans?
They compared 4 groups, controls, MJ-only users, nicotine-only users, and the combined users. And they found that both the marijuana-only users and the combined MJ plus nicotine users had significantly smaller right hippocampal volumes compared to the other 2 groups. That shrinkage is worrying.
But the real intellectual hook here is this abnormal brain behavior relationship they found, this cognitive inversion. Can you explain what the researchers saw with memory scores?
Right. So in the control group, the relationship was what you'd expect. Generally, a larger hippocampus trended toward better memory scores.
Makes sense. Bigger's better.
But in the combined MJ plus nicotine users, they found this unique inverse relationship. A smaller hippocampal volume was associated with better memory scores.
That is completely backwards. So is this the brain compensating and somehow becoming structurally more efficient? Or is it learning to store information in a totally different, maybe even pathological way?
It strongly suggests there are fundamental abnormalities in the neural architecture that underlies your memory processes. It's due to the combined use. The brain isn't necessarily getting better at memory. It's being forced to compensate or reorganize in a weird way.
They're not just two separate effects happening at once.
Not at all. These two compounds are interacting biochemically. The CB1 and the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are densely co-located in the hippocampus, which supports this idea of a complex functional interaction that fundamentally alters how your memory gets encoded and retrieved.
This deep dive has presented, a really challenging and complex set of conflicting risks. Let's try to synthesize the critical and often contradictory takeaways for everyone listening.
Okay, we have to categorize the risks clearly. For acute lethality, dying from an overdose cannabis is objectively in a low-risk category, no question, especially compared to alcohol and heroin. However, for systemic disease, cannabis shows a potentially faster, more acute cardiovascular risk. It can cause rapid heart damage, even in young, healthy users. And that's a sharp contrast to tobacco's primary risk, which is that long-term chronic structural decay.
And in the lungs, the danger's all about mechanics. Tobacco is biologically far more carcinogenic because nicotine shuts down the body's natural cancer defenses. But the mechanics of smoking a joint, that huge puff and that long breath hold, deliver a much higher acute burden of toxic stuff like carbon monoxide and tar.
Exactly. And then finally, combining MJ and nicotine creates these unique and abnormal neurological relationships, like that strange memory inversion, which suggests that the co-use risk is actually greater than the sum of its parts.
We should probably also give some context on addictive potential, which is another crucial measure of risk. The dependent stats after 10 years of use tell a pretty clear story.
They do. The percentage of users who become dependent is highest for tobacco at 24%, alcohol is next around 15 to 16%, and marijuana is significantly lower, down around 8%.
So the addictive potential follows that same relative risk hierarchy as acute lethality.
It does.
So with all of this, what does it mean for the future of how we assess risk in a world where cannabis is just getting more legal and more potent every day?
I think the most thorough assessment of substance risk needs to fundamentally shift. We have to move beyond just legal status and our traditional focus on these chronic, long-term risks like cancer. We need to start equally prioritizing the acute, sometimes immediate, life-threatening cardiovascular effects that come with using cannabinoids.
So it's about shifting focus from the 20-year risk to the 2-hour risk.
Precisely. This acute cardiac danger, especially as all these concentrated and synthetic forms are entering the market, represents an immediate public health challenge that our current risk framework often misses. We just have to remember that not all dangers manifest in 20 years. Some of them can arrive in 2 hours.